Chapter 7, Eravas in Tashban. What had really happened was this. When Eravas saw Shasta hurried away by the Narnians, she found herself alone with two horses who very wisely wouldn't say a word. She never lost her head, even for a moment. She grabbed Bree's halter and stood still, holding both horses. And though her heart was beating as hard as a hammer, she did nothing to show it. As soon as the Narnian lords had passed, she tried to move on again, but before she could take a step, another crier, "Bother all these people," thought Eravas, was heard shouting out, "Way, way, way, way for the Tarkian Larlston." And immediately following the crier came 4 armed slaves and then 4 beasts carrying a litter which was all aflutter with silken curtains and a jingle with silver bells, which was scented the whole street with perfumes and flowers. And the litter, after the litter, female slaves in beautiful clothes, and then a few grooms, runners, pages, and the like. And now Eravas made her first mistake. See the litter? Who do you think's in it? She knew Larceline well, almost as if they had been at school together, because they had often stayed at the same houses and been to the same parties. And Eravas couldn't help looking up to see what Larceline looked like now that she was married and a very great person indeed. It was fatal. The eyes of the two girls met, and immediately Larceline sat up in the litter and burst out at the top of her voice, "Eravas, what on earth are you doing here? Your father!" It was not a moment to lose. Without a second's delay, Eravas let go of the horses, caught the edge of the litter, swung herself up beside Larceline, and whispered furiously in his ear, "Shut up, do you hear? Shut up, you must hide me, tell your people." "But darling," began Larceline in the same loud voice. She didn't mind in the least making people stare. In fact, she rather liked it. "Do what I tell you or I'll never speak to you again," hissed Eravas. Please be quick, Law. It's frightfully important. Tell your people to bring those 2 horses along. Pull all the curtains of the litter and get away somewhere where I can't be found, and do hurry." "All right, darling," said Larceline, and her lazy voice, "Here, 2 of you take Tarkina's horses," this was to the slaves, "and now home. I say, darling, do you think we shall really want the curtains down on a day like this? I mean to say," but Eravas had already drawn the curtains, enclosing Larceline and herself in a rich, scented, but rather stuffy kind of tent. "I mustn't be seen," she said. "My father doesn't know I'm here. I'm running away." "My dear, how perfectly thrilling," said Larceline. "I'm dying to hear all about it. Darling, you're sitting on my dress. Do you mind? That's better. This is a new one. Do you like it? I got it." "Oh, lads, do be serious," said Eravas. "Where's my father?" "Didn't you know?" said Larceline. "He's here, of course. He came to town yesterday and is asking about you everywhere. And to think of you and me being here together and his not knowing anything about it. It's the funniest thing I've ever heard." And she went off into giggles. She always had been a terrible giggler, and Eravas now remembered that. "It wasn't funny at all," she said. "It's dreadfully serious. Where can you hide me?" "No difficulty at all, my dear girls," said Larceline. "I'll take you home. My husband's away and no one will see you." "Phew, it's not much fun with all the curtains drawn. I want to see those people. There's no point in having my new dress on if no one's about to shut up like this." I hope no one heard you when you shouted out at me like that," said Eravas. No, of course, darling," said Larceline absentmindedly, "but you haven't even told me yet what you think of the dress." Do you have friends like that only think about what's important to them and not about you? Sometimes. I think we all get a little selfish, though. Have you ever been the one with the dress? Another thing, said Aravas, you must tell your people to treat those two horses very respectfully. They're part of a secret. They're really talking horses from Narnia. Fancy, said Larlene. How exciting. Darling, have you seen the barbarian queen from Narnia? She's staying in Tashban and present. They say Prince Rabish is madly in love with her. There have been the most wonderful parties and hunts and things in the last fortnight. I can't see that she's so very pretty myself, but some of the Narnian men are lovely. I was taken out at the river party the day before yesterday, and I was wearing my, how shall we prevent your people telling everyone that you've got a visitor dressed like a beggar's brat in your house? It might so easily get around to my father. Now, don't keep fussing. There's a dear, said Laurelyn. We'll get you some proper clothes in a moment. Here we are. The bearers had stopped and the litter was being lowered. When the curtains had been drawn, Aravas found that she was in a courtyard garden, very like the one that Shasta had been taken into a few minutes earlier in another part of the city. Laurelyn would have gone indoors at once, but Aravas reminded her in a frantic whisper to say something to the slaves about not telling anyone of their mistress's strange visitor. Sorry, darling, it had gone right out of my head, said Laurelyn. Here, all of you, and you, doorkeeper, no one is to be let out of the house today, and anyone I catch talking about this young lady will first be beaten to death and then burned alive, and after that be kept on bread and water for 6 weeks. There. Can that really happen? No. If you kill somebody, how are they going to eat after that, right? Although Laurelyn had said she was dying to hear Aravas's story, she told no sign of really wanting to hear it at all. She was, in fact, much better at talking than at listening. She insisted on Aravas having a long and luxurious bath. Calamine's baths are famous, and then dressing her up in the finest clothes before she would let her explain anything. Which are you better at, talking or listening? Make sure you let Grandma know what you decide. Okay. Then the fuss she made about the clothing and dresses nearly drove Aravas mad. She remembered now that Laurelyn had always been like that, interested in clothes and parties and gossip. Aravas had always been more interested in bows and arrows and horses and dogs and swimming. You will guess that each one thought the other silly. But when they were at last they were both seated after a meal, it was chiefly the whipped cream and jelly and fruit and ice sort, in a beautiful pillared room, which Aravas would have liked better if Laurelyn's spoiled pet monkey hadn't been climbing about all the time. Laurelyn at last asked her why she was running away from home. See them? And the peaked place that they were at? When Aravas had finished telling her story, Laurelyn said, but darling, why don't you marry Ashoth Tarakan? Everyone's crazy about him. My husband says he is beginning to be one of the greatest men in Colorman. He's just been made Grand Vizier, and now old Agzathra died. Didn't you know? I don't care. I can't stand the sight of him, said Aravas. But darling, only think, these palaces, and one of them with a beautiful one down at the lake by Ilking, positively ropes and of pearls. I'm told baths are of ass's milk, and you'd see such a lot of me. He can keep his pearls and palaces as far as I'm concerned, said Aravas. You always were a queer girl, said Aravas. Aravas said out Laurelyn. What more do you want? In the end, however, Aravas managed to make her friend believe that she was in earnest and even to discuss plans. There would be no difficulty now about getting 2 horses out of the north gate, and then on to the tombs. No one would stop or question a groom in fine clothes leading a war horse and a lady's saddled horse down to the river. And Laureline had plenty of grooms to send. It wasn't so easy to decide what to do about Erebas herself. She suggested that she could be carried out in a litter with the curtains drawn, but Laureline told her that litters were only used in the city and that the sight of one going out through the gate would be certain to lead to questions. When they had talked for a long time, it was a lot longer because Erebas found she had to keep her friend to the point. At last, Laureline clapped her hands and said, "Oh, I have an idea. There is one way of getting out of the city without using the gates. The Tisserand garden, may he live forever, runs right down to the water, and there is a little water door, only for the palace people, of course. But then you know, dear," there she tittered a little, "we almost are palace people. I say, it is lucky for you that you came to me. The dear Tisserand, may his name live forever, is so kind. We are asked to the palace almost every day, and it's like a second home. I love all of the dear princes and princesses that I positively adore, Prince Radabash. I might run in and see if any of the palace ladies at any hour of the night or day, why shouldn't I slip in with you after dark and let you out by the water door?" There were always a few punts and things tied up outside of it, and even if we were caught, all would be lost, said Erebas. A punt, by the way, is a kind of little water conveyance, like a boat. "Oh, darling, don't get so excited," said Laureline. I was going to say, even if we were caught, everyone would only say it was one of my mad jokes. I'm getting quite well known for them. On the other day, do listen, dear, this is frightfully funny. I meant it would all be lost for me, said Erebas a little sharply. "Oh, yes, I do see what you mean. Darling, we can you think of a better plan?" Erebas couldn't and answered, "No, we'll have to risk it. When can we start?" "Oh, not tonight," said Laureline. "Of course not tonight. There's a great feast on tonight. I must start getting my hair done for it in a few minutes. And the whole palace is going to be a blaze of lights, and such a crowd it would have to be tomorrow night." This was bad news for Erebas, but she had to make the best of it. The afternoon passed very slowly, and it was a relief when Laureline went out to the banquet, for Erebas was very tired of her giggling and her talking about dresses and parties and weddings and engagements and sandals and scandals, and she went to bed early. And that part she did enjoy. It was so nice to have pillows and sheets again. But the next day passed very slowly. Laureline wanted to go back on the whole arrangement and kept telling Erebas Narnia was a country of perpetual snow and ice inhabited by demons and sorcerers, and she was really mad to think of going there. "And with a peasant boy too," said Laureline. "Darling, think of it. It's not nice." Erebas had thought of it a good deal, and she was so tired of Laureline's silliness by now that for the first time she began to think of traveling with Shasta was really more fun than fashionable life with Tashbaan. So she only replied, "You forget that I'll be nobody just like him when we get to Narnia. And anyway, I promised." "And to think," said Laureline, almost crying, "that if it only you had the sense you could be the wife of the Grand Vizier." Erebas went away to have private words with the horses. "You must go with a groom a little before sunset down to the tomb," she said. No more of those packs. You'll be saddled and bridled again, but they'll have to be food in Hwin's saddlebags and a full water skin behind yours, said Bree. The man has orders to let you both have a good long drink at the far side of the bridge. And then Narnia and the North, whispered Bree. But what if Shasta is not at the tombs? Wait for him, of course, said Aravas. I hope you've been quite comfortable. Never better stabled in my life, said Bree. But if the husband of that tittering Tarquinia friend of yours is paying this head groom to get the best oats, then I think the head groom is cheating him. Aravas and Laurelin had supper in a pillared room. About 2 hours later, they were ready to start. Aravas was dressed to look like his superior slave girl in a great house and wore a veil over her face. They had agreed that if any questions were asked, Laurelin would pretend to be that Aravas was a slave and that she was taking her as a present to one of the princesses. The two girls went out on foot. A very few minutes brought them to the palace gates. Hence, there were, of course, soldiers on guard, but the officer knew Laurelin quite well and called his men to attention and saluted. They passed into the Hall of Pillars, and then the Hall of the Statues, and then down the colonnade, passing the great beaten copper doors of the throne room. It was all magnificent beyond description, what they could see of it in the dim lights of the lamps. Presently, they came out into the garden court, which sloped downhill on a number of terraces. On the far side of that, they came to the old palace. It had already grown almost quite dark, and now they found themselves in maze corridors lit only by occasional torches fixed in brackets on the walls. Laurelin halted at the place where you could either go left or right. Go on, said Aravas, where her heart was beating terribly, and who still felt that her father might run into them in any corner. I'm just wondering, said Laurelin. I'm not absolutely sure which way we go from here. I think it's to the left. I'm almost sure it's to the left. What fun this is. They looked to the left-hand way and found themselves in a passage that was hardly lighted at all, and soon began going down deep steps. Oh, it's all right, said Laurelin. I'm sure we're right now. I remember these steps. But at that moment, a moving light appeared ahead. A second later appeared from round a distant corner, and dark shapes of two men walking backward and carrying tall candles. And of course, it was only before royalties that people walked backward. Aravas felt Laurelin grip her arm, so that all of a sudden, that sudden grip, which almost a pinch, and which means that a person who is gripping you is very frightened indeed. Aravas thought it odd that Laurelin should be afraid of the Tisroc if he were really such a friend of hers, but there was no time to go into thinking. Laurelin was hurrying her back to the top of the steps on tiptoes and groping wildly along the wall. Here's a door, she whispered, quick. They went in, drew the door softly behind them, and found themselves in pitch darkness. Aravas could hear Laurelin breathing that she was terrified. Tish, preserve us, whispered Laurelin. What shall we do if he comes in here? Can we hide? There was a soft carpet under their feet. They groped forward into the room and blundered onto the sofa. Let's lie down behind it, whimpered Laurelin. I do wish we hadn't come. There was just room between the sofa and the curtained wall that the two girls got down. Laurelin managed to get the better position and was completely covered. The upper part of Aravas's face stuck out behind the sofa so that if anyone came in that room with a light and happened to look at exactly the right place, they would see her. But of course, because she was wearing a veil, they would not see at once. They would not at once look like a feathered and paired. What they saw not at once looked like a feathered and a pair of eyes, forehead and a pair of eyes. Aravas shoved deeply to try and make Laurelin give her a little more room. But Laurelin, now quite selfish in her panic, fought back and pinched her feet. They gave up and lay still, panting a little. Their own breath seemed dreadfully noisy, but there was no other noise. "Is it safe?" said Aravas in the tiniest possible whisper. I think so," began Larlene, "but my poor nerves." And then come the most terrible noise they could have heard at that very moment. The noise of the door opening. And then came light. And because Aravas couldn't get her head any further behind the sofa, she saw everything. First came two slaves, deaf and dumb, as Aravas rightly guessed, and therefore used at the most secret councils, walking backwards and carrying candles. They took up their stand, one at each side of the sofa, which was a good thing, for of course, now it was harder to see anyone, to see Aravas once a slave was in front of her and she was looking between his heels. Then came in an old man, very fat, wearing a curious pointed cap, by which she knew immediately that he was the Tisroc. At least, the least of the jewels with which he was covered was worth more than all of the clothes and weapons of all the Narnian lords put together. But he was so fat and of such a mass of frills and pleats and baubles and buttons and tassels and talisman that Aravas couldn't help thinking that Narnian fashions, at any rate for men, looked nicer. After came a tall young man with a feathered and jeweled turban on his head and an ivory sheathed head skinter at his side. He seemed very excited, and his eyes and teeth flashed fiercely in the candlelight. Last of all came the little hump-backed, winced old man, in whom she recognized with a shudder of the new Grand Vizier and her own betrothed husband, Ashatha Tarkhan himself. As soon as all three had entered the room, the door was shut. Tisroc seated himself on the divan with a sigh of contentment, and the young man took his place standing before him, and the Grand Vizier got down on his knees and elbows and laid flat-faced on the carpet. And that's the end of chapter 7.